Welcome to ArchiTreats Food for Thought, sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives. We're so glad to see you all here on this beautiful day. Please remember before we begin to silence or turn off your cell phones. Thank you. Next week, on Wednesday, April 28th, archivist Nancy Dupree will conduct a workshop about research techniques and tips for using Ancestry.com, and our registration forms are available in the research room if you would like to join us for this workshop, or you can register on our website. Plan now to join us for ArchiTreats next month on Thursday, May 20th for Rob Volney-Reiser's presentation, Montgomery's U.S. District Court, A History. Today's program is part of a statewide Becoming Alabama initiative to commemorate 3 landmark events in the development of Alabama: the Creek War, the Civil War and Emancipation, and the Civil Rights Movement. Today's speaker teaches U.S. history at the University of Houston. His specialty is the antebellum South and the coming of the Civil War. He received degrees from California State University, Fullerton, and Louisiana State University. He has authored several books on the Civil War. His book, William Lowndes Yancey and the Coming of the Civil War, which he will discuss today, received the James Raleigh Award from the Southern Historical Association and the Jefferson Davis Award from the Museum of the Confederacy. It's available in the lobby for purchase, and our speaker will be available after the program to sign your copy. Please welcome Eric Walther.
Good afternoon. It's good to be back in Montgomery. It's been far too long. I want to thank Sherry for inviting me and making all of this possible, and appreciate your attention. As we mark the sesquicentennial of secession this year, it's very fitting that we're gathering here in Montgomery to take a close look at a man dubbed the Prince of the Fire Eaters by a Cincinnati journalist, Montgomery's own William Lowndes Yancey. In 1860, due to Yancey's role in splitting the National Democratic Convention, our nation accelerated its plunge into tumult and conflict. Conflict dominated the life of Yancey, especially his childhood. Conflict between his mother and his stepfather, and conflict between these parents and their children. Conflict marked and marred Yancey's college years. As a headstrong teenager in South Carolina, Yancey used the newspaper press to oppose John C. Calhoun's extreme states' rights positions. As a young man and plantation owner in Alabama, Yancey began his quick conversion from unionist to states' rights advocate. But even before that metamorphosis, he had already begun to cast himself as a champion of the South in its ever-increasing conflicts with the North. As a 30-year-old United States congressman, Yancey relished oratorical conflict with established giants of the federal Congress, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and a rising star named Stephen A. Douglas. Shortly after that, he began his second term in the House. Shortly after he began that second term, he resigned, explaining that the compromises inherent in democratic and open debate watered down his principles, and rather than capitulate, he would, secede and stand by his ideals. Between 1846, when he left Congress, and 1862, when he took a seat in the Confederate Senate, Yancey remained at the center of various storms of controversy within Alabama and beyond its borders. In the 1850s, he consciously and publicly declared himself the defender of the South. During the presidential campaign of 1860, only Yancey, among leaders of disunion, decided to tackle his foes on their home field by undertaking an extraordinary speaking tour of the entire country that included stops at the Cooper Institute in New York and Faneuil Hall in Boston, both of which were bastions of abolitionism. Yancey went there to the Lion's Den in the North and delivered pro-slavery lectures in Boston and elsewhere, and defied unconditional unionists of all kinds. Only during the last few years of his life, his short life, he died just days shy of his 49th birthday, did he become mature and introspective enough to consider the value of conflict resolution in his desperate effort to build a lasting and principled Confederate Republic. Yancey's father, Benjamin Cudworth Yancey, was a Navy veteran and a promising young lawyer from Abbeville, South Carolina. But he died from malaria in 1817. The late Yancey had served with some distinction in the quasi-war with France aboard the USS Constellation in 1799. He then entered politics as a Federalist and a distinct nationalist. He began his law practice with another federally oriented young attorney named John C. Calhoun, and later with yet another Federalist, Daniel E. Huger of Charleston. The very name of his firstborn son, William Lowndes, further revealed the father's political outlook by honoring the South Carolina-born and Georgia politician by the name of William Lowndes, who was a Federalist. A famed orator in his own right, Yancey's father was remembered by contemporaries for his weapons of invective and sarcasm, his ardent, inflexible, decisive style on the stump. His first son inherited a lot from his father. The 3-year-old William and his beloved younger brother Ben, left with only vague memories and stories of their father, relied upon their mother and her family in Georgia for several years. Storms of conflict ravaged the Byrd family. Carolyn Byrd's siblings, William and Catherine, engaged frequently in bitter quarrels, often involving their children. Some of their quarrels within the family actually made it to the press, with brothers denouncing each other's relations. Legend had it that family patriarch William Byrd once remarked that if he were to make a raid on hell, he would select his daughter, Caroline, as his first lieutenant. Growing up with this kind of family left young William both vulnerable and impressionable. For decades, he would find himself drawn toward various men he saw as surrogate fathers. They were a diverse lot, and Yancey modified himself with every successive experience, moving briskly from staunch Unionist to the archetypal Secessionist. Yancey need not have looked so far and so often for a paternal figure had his mother remarried a better man. Instead, Carolyn Byrd Yancey found herself drawn toward Reverend Nathan SS Beeman, a New England Presbyterian minister who moved to Hancock County, Georgia under doctor's orders. There he ran the Mount Zion Academy, a private school, the same school that William and his younger brother Ben attended. A dramatic and forceful orator from the pulpit, both in spiritual and secular political matters, and an unrestrained editor of a local newspaper, the Reverend provided models of uncompromising public, political, and religious zeal. Yancey, of course, would adopt those qualities in his own crusade for disunion. Through the Mount Zion Missionary newspaper, Beeman offered editorial comment, mostly condemnation, on all sorts of issues. He complained that the proliferation of little theaters would continue until every pin-feathered actor may flap his wings and crow majestically upon the pinnacle of his own dunghill. He attacked the practice of pitching dollars, shooting rifles, gouging, breaking skulls, biting off ears and noses associated with taverns and gambling halls. He railed against dueling, drinking, and Sabbath breaking, but each year in Georgia, Beeman focused more and more attention condemning slavery. He castigated those who were guilty of the crime of man-stealing, men who have made traffic of human blood, bones, and sinews, especially those who had participated in the Atlantic slave trade. He called for the cessation of all traffic in human flesh. Beeman, on a personal level, in fact, simply could not practice the Christian life that he preached. Yes, he abstained from most pleasures of the flesh. There was no gambling, drinking, or Sabbath breaking for this minister or anyone in his household. But shortly after his marriage to Yancey's mother in 1821, the 6-year-old William Yancey witnessed and suffered from horrible domestic crimes. 5 months after this marriage, Beeman locked his wife in a closet after one of many arguments. Several hours later, a house slave let her out. When Beeman discovered this, he supposedly thundered, if locks would not hold her, perhaps nails would, shoved her into a bedroom and nailed the door closed. Carolyn cried out for help through the window. Another report claimed that Beeman once told his friends that Carolyn had an impossible temper, one that somehow hastened the death of her first husband. She wore out his life, and her father said that no man could live with her, Beeman alleged. A key source of the political turmoil that lay ahead for this conflict-ridden union involved Caroline's slaves. When she and Beeman married, he, of course, became the lawful owner and master of her 3 slaves, a mother and 2 young children. In the fall of 1822, the First Presbyterian Church of Troy, New York, called Beeman back to the pulpit to fill a vacancy there. He accepted and moved his family north in the spring of 1823, but of course before he could do that, he had to reckon with these 3 slaves who he owned. The preacher who condemned slave trading, yet simultaneously accepted money for advertisements in his newspaper for runaway slaves, might have manumitted these people and sent them to Liberia, or brought them to the north and sent them free, but instead he trafficked in human flesh. He sold these 3 human beings for $700. His stepsons would never forget this, as Beeman's fame spread through his work with abolitionists including William Lloyd Garrison, Theodore Dwight Weld, Lyman Beecher, and others in North America and Great Britain. On many levels, Beeman defined the rest of Yancey's life, because to Yancey, Beeman represented everything bad about Yankees in general and anti-slavery preachers in particular. They were cold, meddling, hateful hypocrites and tyrants. The acrimony between the Reverend and Mrs. Beeman only increased in New York. Both Mrs. Yancey and the children faced constant threats of physical and emotional attacks, whereas most households, even sternly patriarchal ones, could often count on the love and nurture of the mother to balance the power and authority of the father. Such was not the case for the Beemans. Carolyn used a walking stick to strike the head of her stepdaughter and often hit her children with the heel of her shoe or slapped them. Not even the house servants were safe. Carolyn raged at them, calling them strumpet and bitch, and threatened to beat them with fire tongs. Reverend Beeman, determined to save his children from an eternity of damnation, seldom spared inflicting pain to force obedience to him and to his God. On one occasion, Beeman beat William and Ben until stripes showed on their backs. For William Yancey, the specter and anticipation of violence and abuse must have been almost as bad as the abuse itself. He watched helplessly as his parents screamed at one another and struck his siblings, and that could have only added to his own trauma. Moreover, life in Troy struck the pre-teenaged Yancey as the very antithesis of life in the South. The Erie Canal had opened its eastern terminus at Troy the very year, 1823, that the Yancey Beeman household moved there. Population exploded as industrialization and a full-blown market economy transformed the region. Vice and corruption popped up everywhere. Troy and the neighboring town Waterfleet became known as the Barbary Coast of the East, complete with taverns named Black Rag and Tub of Blood. Prostitution flourished. All this gave Reverend Beeman much to lash out against. It must also have seemed like Sodom and Gomorrah to the young Yancey. To top things off for the Southern boy, he witnessed the bewildering spectacle of several score black slaves in Rensselaer County in the 1820s, commingling with over 1,000 free blacks, many of whom had their own churches, a sight he had never been exposed to in the South. The young Yancey children had to have perceived at least part of Northern society as wicked, sinful, vice-ridden, and tumultuous. In stark contrast, the South, less personified by Yancey's mother than by these vague memories of his own childhood and hazy notions of his father, seemed warm, ordered, and safe, with a clearly defined place and role for all, black and white, male and female, parent and child. In Yancey's mind, the South represented harmony, stability, and order, a place where white men protected their families and cared for their slaves, until Beeman appeared with his lies and his violent cruelties. In Yancey's boyish mind, the sunny South had structure and order, everyone knew their place, and every year was pretty much like the last, focused on growing cotton. Yancey escaped the tumult and conflict at home when he entered Williams College, Massachusetts in 1830, at the age of 16. That was typical then. As he would do so often in college, Yancey displayed the typical characteristics of those who suffered from childhood abuse: low self-esteem, depression, inappropriately lashing out his pent-up rage, fiercely attacking authority figures. Yancey became a rebel long before 1861. He violated rules of student conduct with great frequency, anything from leaving town without permission to drinking, using profanity, using playing cards, breaking glass windows on campus, all fairly typical and none too serious marks of teenage rebelliousness, but also things that annoyed Beeman, who was paying Yancey's college tuition. The capstone came when Yancey and his friends disrupted a Methodist prayer meeting at the private home of a man named Daniel Evans by whispering, talking, loudly shuffling their feet. After the congregants somehow finished their service and lingered to socialize, Yancey and his co-conspirators turned violent. They threw into Evans' home a large cask full of water and a brass kettle, both of which spilled their contents all over the floor. The next day, whether out of smug satisfaction or remorse, Yancey got himself good and drunk. Evans reported the outrage to Williams College officials and demanded retribution, but he also wanted civil authorities to act. The incident secured Yancey a suspension from the last few weeks of his spring term, and he never completed his studies and received his degree. By the time Yancey reached Congress in 1845, local lore had transformed this incident into a rumor that Yancey had been expelled from college for throwing a pickle barrel through the window of a Methodist church. But in case the metaphor isn't lost, his stepfather is a reverend, and he's disrupting violently a church meeting, a religious meeting. And two of his co-conspirators actually also ended up in Congress, and one became a district court judge in New York. So sometimes teenagers outgrow bad habits, sometimes they don't. By 1833, Yancey had grown weary of the North and longed for the simpler life he imagined back in the South. He eventually turned to his favorite aunt, Louisa Byrd Cunningham, and their family in Greenville, South Carolina. There, his youthful impressions of the slave South found confirmation. Robert Cunningham owned over 100 slaves at his Rosemont plantation. For Yancey to earn his keep, to fill his place in this ordered society, Yancey tended to the enormous bookkeeping and daily business of the plantation while basking in the love and tranquility that truly existed within the Cunningham household. He also studied law with Benjamin Perry, who had emerged as the leading upcountry Unionist in South Carolina during their recent nullification crisis. At the same time, Yancey's father's law partner, Daniel Hugie, teamed up with James Lewis Pettigrew to bolster unionism in the Tidewater areas of South Carolina, again during and after the nullification crisis. Robert Cunningham served as leader of several unionist militia groups ready for the armed defiance of John C. Calhoun and his much more radical lieutenant, Robert Barnwell Rhett. Yancey dove into that conflict as a captain of one of those unionist militias. As inter-Carolina politics continued to simmer into the summer of 1834, the not-quite 20-year-old Yancey made his first major public speech, the first of a lifetime of public remarks all aimed at preserving the order and stability of the South that he both loved and idealized. Over time, these words would drip with irony, but at the moment, Yancey passionately and sincerely warned of that evil genius of our land, disunion. According to Yancey, the real aim of Calhoun and the Nullies. Yancey warned, "Listen not then, my countrymen, to the voice which whispers that Americans can no longer be mutual worshipers at the shrine of freedom, no longer can exist together, citizens of the same republic." Yancey asked, "Can anyone view the course taken by some of the most talented and influential men in our state and country for the last few years and not see the evident tendency of their proceedings to be disunion and a Southern Confederacy?" The daring young Yancey pledged that these traitors would be beaten back by Unionists, if needs be, with the sword and the musket. Yancey's politics, his earnestness, his drive, and actually he did have a sense of humor, won the heart of Benjamin Perry. Late in life, Perry professed to love Yancey most affectionately, even while blaming Yancey, for starting the Civil War. True, Yancey's temper boiled over too often. Once Perry himself had to stand between Yancey and another law student as they drew pistols on one another. But Perry thought Yancey possessed many noble qualities of both head and heart, including genius and talent, especially in oratory. Perry remembered Yancey as kind and affectionate, warm and generous, devoted to his friends. He was a very handsome young man with a bright, cheerful face, ever inspiring confidence and good feeling. In one of the greatest ironies of Yancey's life, Benjamin Perry, Unionist to the end, gave Yancey the unconditional love that the man so craved. The best that was within Yancey became apparent to young Sarah Caroline Earl in 1835. The two wed 3 days after Yancey turned 21 in 1835. Their marriage was a good one, stable, happy, and loving. Yancey proved an indulgent and doting father to his 5 children and toward his brother's children. There was no cruelty in his home. He admitted to friends he preferred to be too indulgent toward children, that he wanted children to romp and play, as of course he never could. For the very public Yancey, one of his greatest accomplishments was to prevent verbal and physical abuse from ever taking root in his home and affecting his wife or children. He only sought their safety and happiness. He protected, loved, and nurtured his wife and children as an ideal Southern paternalist. And with his marriage came 35 slaves from the Earl family. Instantly, Yancey achieved planter status, and like so many others from the East, he decided to head to the untamed west of Alabama, just in time to watch the flush times of the region turn bust. He settled in Cahaba, of course then the capital, and met an older cousin of his named Jesse Bean from the Byrd family, already established in Cahaba as a planter and politician. Bean helped Yancey obtain co-ownership of the local newspaper, the Cahaba Democrat. Yancey suffered almost immediately from producing too much cotton while demand plummeted. Revenue from ads and subscriptions to the Cahaba Democrat dropped off quickly. Like most other Southerners in search of an explanation, or at least a scapegoat, Yancey blamed the financial panic of 1837 squarely upon the Bank of the United States and its mostly Whig political party supporters. Yancey's world had turned inside out. And to rub salt in the wounds, his ever-critical mother chimed in. After receiving an edition of William's newspaper, she wrote to her younger son, Ben, about the Democrat, "It contains very little that will interest me." Now legally separated from Reverend Beeman, she went on to tell Ben, "I shall feel no delicacy in living with you that I now do in living with William," and complained that William has diminished instead of improving Sarah's property. To the end of her life in 1859, on every visit to William and Sarah's home, Caroline deluged both with complaints about their spending habits, their funding for her, their management of their slaves, and even, possibly out of jealousy, the tightness of their marital bonds. With various personal and economic pressures building upon him, Yancey naturally grew defensive. In his newspaper, he frequently defended slavery against the small but rising tide of abolitionists, men like Beeman, and therefore began his remarkable metamorphosis. Still an unconditional unionist, Yancey now combined his old contempt toward disunionists with a thorough condemnation of every opponent of the Democratic Party, lumping all of his foes into that curious mass of nullifiers, Federalists, and United States Bankites amalgamated and termed Whiggism. It doesn't make any sense. As evil forces seemed to gather quickly around him, Yancey found an unexpected hero in the person of John C. Calhoun, who he had just defied. In 1837, the citizens of Vermont petitioned Congress to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. The infamous gag rule had already taken effect in the House of Representatives to stifle and prevent such debate. But now John C. Calhoun raised his powerful voice to stop the Senate from discussing slavery as well. Yancey wrote in his newspaper, "Widely as we have differed and still differ with that distinguished statesman on some points, on the defense of slavery, Yancey and Calhoun had suddenly closed ranks." By the summer of 1838, Yancey called Calhoun one of the most distinguished statesmen of the Republic, quite an improvement from the Aaron Burr and political madman of only 3 years ago. The new antagonists replaced Calhoun in Yancey's mind. In his editorials, Yancey now concluded that Whig Party leaders Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, and even the slaveholding Henry Clay represented the political vanguard of abolitionism and nationalism run amok. Deluded fanatics like Beeman himself, now a Whig. As Yancey's fortunes continued to deteriorate, two cataclysmic events occurred in 1838 that forever changed Yancey. In August, his second son, George, died at 6 months old. It was an emotional blow that staggered Yancey. Soon after that, while on one of his regular return visits to Greenville, South Carolina, he got carried away while listening to a political debate and called one of the candidates a blackguard, scoundrel, man of ill repute. A teenager in the crowd named Elias Earl called Yancey a liar. Yancey slapped his face. Earl reported the incident to his father, Dr. Robinson Earl, who was Yancey's wife's uncle. After stewing for 2 days, Robinson and Elias Earl came to Greenville looking for Yancey, who was ready for them. Armed with a pistol, a large knife, and a sword stick, Yancey encountered Dr. Earl at a tavern in town. The doctor, a man who Yancey estimated to be 6'2" and weighed 225 pounds, and Yancey was much smaller than that. Dr. Earl carried his own heavy walking stick and a small knife. The two began to discuss things in a friendly manner, but at one point Dr. Earl himself called Yancey a, quote, damned liar. After a moment's hesitation, Yancey responded by drawing his gun and insisting, "Now call that back or take a shot." Earl menacingly started toward Yancey. During the ensuing scuffle, Yancey brought the pistol toward Earl and shot him. He later said that was an accident. Dr. Earl's head slumped to the side, but he continued staggering toward Yancey, who now deliberately and repeatedly hit Earl on the head with the spent gun until the pistol actually broke to pieces. Yancey later boasted, "Every blow brought blood copiously." Still unable to halt his wounded opponent, Yancey then drew his sword from its sheath and stabbed toward Earl's stomach but missed. Finally, witnesses separated the two, but Earl died that evening. An unrepentant Yancey wrote of his version of the story to his brother Ben the day after the encounter. He admitted that his volatile temper hastened his violent response to Earl's insult. "If not so passionate, I might have used a cane only and beaten him." He fully expected to be found guilty of manslaughter and to receive a prison sentence of 1 to 2 years. Although he regretted the prospect of separation from his family and his inability to provide for them financially, Yancey focused on what he considered a tremendous accomplishment. He recalled the recent death of his infant son and the reputation of his surviving child as he concluded, "I have done my duty as a man, and he who grossly insulted me lies now with a clod upon his bosom. The blood of the only man who ever called me a damned liar is now a legacy to my son and a warning to others who feel like browbeating a Yancey." Convicted of manslaughter in October and given a 1-year sentence to prison, Yancey obtained his freedom in January 1839 due to the largesse of South Carolina Governor Patrick Noble, who was so generous with his pardons that in his 2-year term as governor, he had to request additional pardon forms from the state printing office. With a new lease on freedom, Yancey decided to sell the Cahaba Democrat and move to Wetumpka, which was then Coosa County, of course, for a fresh start, but fate didn't cooperate. That summer, a conflict between two feuding overseers led one to poison a well that he knew his nemesis frequented. Before the intended victim got there, the bulk of Yancey's slaves stopped to drink from that well. 2 died very quickly. Several others remained ill for months and then died. Some never fully recovered. Yancey's summer crop went unattended as he tried to save the lives of his slaves and the fortune they represented. After years of debt that involved selling many of his original 35 slaves, this latest blow left Yancey with but 6 slaves by 1840, and therefore well below the planter class. Although he would gradually rebuild his slave labor force and run a profitable dairy farm on the outskirts of Montgomery, Yancey turned his attention now to law and politics, and in turn this brought him back to his cousin Jesse Bean and Jesse Bean's states' rights friends, particularly the literal and figurative giant of Alabama politics at the time, Dixon Hall Lewis. Yancey won an election to Alabama's lower house in 1841 and to the Senate in 1843. Although far from spectacular, his performance in the state capitol earned him the respect of fellow Democrats and a special place in the heart of Dixon Hall Lewis, the next of Yancey's surrogate fathers. Yancey accelerated Yancey's conversion to states' rights wing of the party and promoted Yancey to fill a vacant seat in the federal Congress, which Yancey captured in 1844. Although in Yancey's mind his ideals about politics had not changed, his recent swift conversion to states' rights did not escape the notice of his Whig opponent. Daniel Watrous stunned Yancey at one point when they were having a public debate by challenging the Democrat on his strong states' rights position and by producing one of Yancey's editorials attacking Calhoun from South Carolina. Trapped, Yancey diffused the situation with humor. He simply laughed loudly and said, "Well, Watrous, where the devil did you get that old thing from?" and moved on. On Election Day, Yancey did defeat Watrous, but by a margin of only 60 votes after 4,234 cast. Very narrow. Upon his arrival in Washington, Yancey was given the honor of temporarily taking the Speaker's chair. He declined, admitting his, and I quote, entire want of acquaintance with the rules. The 30-year-old orator had come to the Capitol to talk, not to pound a gavel. And within a few short days, Yancey talked himself into national headlines. The question of Texas annexation, he explained, by its towering greatness overtops all minor issues. But on that question, Thomas L. Klingman, a Whig from North Carolina, had not proven himself to Yancey sufficiently loyal to his section. Yancey asserted that the extension of slavery to Texas and the impact of slave expansion on the existing slave states had not sufficient interest or dignity to draw the intellect or his passions of Klingman. Yancey stated that Klingman has given a stab to the institutions of his own land and wears the garb of its enemy. When Congress repealed that gag rule in 1844, with Southerner Klingman voting for that, the repeal, that had already proven to Yancey that the Whig lacked honor. Klingman thought differently and challenged Yancey to a duel. On January 13, 1845, the two met in Maryland. Yancey and Klingman walked 10 short paces apart, faced each other and fired. Both missed their adversary, but satisfied one another that honor had been restored. The matter ended. They went back to Congress. Yancey made the rest of his shots oratorical ones, although he almost got himself in another duel with Alexander Stephens of Georgia, another Southern Whig who Yancey didn't think was pro-South enough. Throughout his life in these encounters, Yancey only took on other Southerners because, obviously, he thought collectively Northerners lacked honor, and so you don't challenge them to duels. There is a certain logic in that. His constituents supported Yancey and re-elected him overwhelmingly, with many Whigs crossing party lines this time to support him. During his brief time in Congress, Yancey's radicalism intensified quickly. His reverence for Senators Lewis and Calhoun and Representative Robert Barnwell Rhett grew immensely as he watched them battle for the South. When a Vermont Whig remarked on the House floor that Yancey had been a nullifier, the Alabamian seized the twin opportunities to correct history and to praise the men he had once vilified. Though I did not belong to the nullifiers, and though my party and theirs were arrayed in hostile battalions and prepared for civil war, yet I will say of them that a band of more honorable men never existed. They never forsook one of the great principles on which they had united. As for his youthful opposition to these men, he dismissed it by remarking, and here's a professional politician, I might plead infancy, however, in my own behalf, but I am not disposed to do so, though actually underage at the time. Seated now immediately next to Robert Barnwell Rhett on the House floor, when that Carolina secessionist leader got into a shouting match with that vile old abolitionist John Quincy Adams, Yancey, and not the House Speaker, leaped to his feet and proclaimed that Adams was out of order. Meanwhile, Yancey set his sights on Daniel Webster, at one point announcing that Webster has two characters which Proteus-like he can assume as his interests or necessities demand, the God-like and the hell-like, the God-like Daniel and Black Dan. Despite the thrill of verbal combat and the public attention that he received and craved, Yancey grew weary of the political process. Too many men, even fellow Democrats like Stephen Douglas, lacked principle. He resigned early in 1846, just after his re-election, because of his disgust toward compromises of principle that he found dominating both political parties. One of the few congressmen he truly respected was David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, and that, of course, ended instantly when Wilmot offered his proviso that as Americans began our invasion of Mexico in 1846, that slavery would be prohibited in any and all territories we might acquire through that conflict. This ignited the territorial question that dominated American politics for the next 15 years and resulted in secession and civil war. Meanwhile, it provided the catalyst for Yancey to complete his political conversion. With Dixon Hall Lewis, John Archibald Campbell, and others, Yancey in 1848 helped craft the Alabama Platform, the official response of Alabama's Democrats to the Wilmot Proviso, and its polar opposite. Congress must adopt the platform and help protect and expand slavery in all America's national domain, Yancey demanded, and the others. Old territories as well as the vast new Mexican cession. Working closely with Lewis, Yancey authored a plank that insisted that either the Democratic Party adopt his platform at its national convention in 1848, or all Alabama delegates must withdraw from the proceedings. Of course, moderates at the Baltimore Convention soundly rejected the Alabama platform, but only Yancey and one other man, Philip A. Ray of Alabama, left the convention as instructed. The others remained, trying in vain to gain the vice presidential nomination for Alabamian William R. King. The politics as usual by his colleagues, their refusal to stand by principle more than irked Yancey, who returned home to Montgomery via Charleston, where he joined a rally of Carolinians in support of the ideas that he had expressed in the Alabama platform. That rally in Charleston included Barnwell Rhett, the leader of secession there, and Daniel U.G., the great Carolina fire eater and the friend of Yancey's father. Yancey and John C. Calhoun now literally stood together in this crowd in Charleston, flanked by Rhett. This new radicalism alienated Yancey from most Alabama Democrats, most of whom now pronounce his political career dead and gone. Attacks from most politicians did not ruffle Yancey's feathers too much, but he felt deeply wounded when he learned that as far as Dixon Hall Lewis was concerned, the whole Alabama platform episode was merely represented a bargaining chip, an attempt to get some leverage for states' rights Democrats within the party, but nothing more than that. Yancey complained to Lewis, "I confess I am somewhat humiliated by Lewis's abandonment. I thought fondly and made it a point of self-congratulation that I was looking down with undisguised contempt upon a pack of party curs which had been snarling around the path I was treading." Yancey felt the same about his defiance of a fickle press in Alabama, which first praised his stance and then condemned him for leaving the convention. All these actions, he pleaded to Lewis, were on behalf of his country. The fundamental problem, as Yancey saw it, was not Yancey, but the blind veneration of others to political parties, a force so compelling that it had apparently even ensnared Dixon Hall Lewis himself. With his anger toward Lewis now barely concealed, Yancey insisted that it was the immense power of party which could thus drive men so completely from their position and cause them to curse a friend whose bold blow on their behalf had aroused party anger, and they turned and stabbed their defender. Yancey predicted that the South would never gain strength by yielding to the North, and that by submitting to encroachment and by swallowing our pledge. Yancey even considered creating a new political party. The prospects of defeat he considered inconsequential. It is the meek and timid who are fit to be made slaves of, not the bold and brave. Grown more self-confident as well as self-righteous, Yancey now viewed Lewis as a sorry political mentor and an unreliable ally. On October 9, 1848, when the great Lewis suddenly died, Yancey seamlessly latched on to the last of his surrogate fathers, the most likely of the bunch given Yancey's history, none other than John C. Calhoun. And just at that time, within weeks of this move by Yancey toward Calhoun, the Carolina senator wrote privately to friends, "We ought rather than to yield an inch take any alternative, even if it should be disunion." Yancey agreed and consummated his political conversion. And by that time that Count Calhoun died in March 1850, the 35-year-old Yancey had reached a point where he no longer sought a mentor, a father, a leader. He was now his own man, and that man knew to his core that the political parties which dominated America would never adequately protect Southern rights and interests. One political conflict after another, one seeming betrayal after another, now resulted in the making of William Lowndes Yancey, secessionist. When Henry Clay proposed his great compromise bill of 1850, Yancey grew defiant. That complex bill that eventually passed under the chicanery and leadership of Stephen A. Douglas roused Yancey and other fire eaters like nothing had before. In Macon, Georgia, in August of 1850, Yancey shared a stage with Barnwell Rhett of South Carolina and leading Georgia secessionists, and he stole the show. Yancey quoted former Governor Troup of Georgia, a nullifier who once proclaimed, "The argument is exhausted and we must stand by our arms." According to a local reporter, in the avowal of his disunion sentiments, Mr. Yancey was more candid and manly than Rhett. He faced the music like a man and openly proclaimed there was no remedy in the Constitution for existing evils, that there was actually no union now in existence, and that the South ought and must set up for itself. Like other fire eaters, Yancey smoldered for years after their efforts to secede in 1850, 51, 52 failed. Even in his retirement from elective office, though, Yancey remained in the public eye and active in state and local politics throughout the 1850s. His effort to create a Southern Rights Party fizzled pathetically in 1852, but time proved that that effort was well spent because that movement galvanized a whole series of men across this state who would later join him at the end of the decade and actually push this union through. His law practice alone made him a public man, as they used to say in the 19th century, and his partnership with lawyer John Elmore reinforced his secessionism. Elmore's family in South Carolina and their political and marital bonds combined with the Rets of South Carolina, and again, that whole family nurtured Yancey's radicalism. A commencement address on July 15, 1856 at the University of Alabama provided Yancey with a public forum to air out his private musings on the Northern author Frederick Law Olmsted's recently published A Journey to the Seaboard Southern States. Olmsted set out to find proof that slavery retarded and degraded all of Southern society, and while he included that African American slaves were not quite so horribly treated as he imagined, he did still condemn the institution and slaveholders. Yancey dedicated his oration now to these college students to the Southern stump versus the Northern schoolhouse, and wanted to show that one leads to the Southern supremacy in governmental matters and lands the citizen at the Capitol in Washington, while the other leads to the supremacy in the dollar and cent view and lands the citizen in the patent office of Washington. Qualitatively different from every other public utterance in his life, this oration revealed how the culture of the Southwest of the time gave him the sense of place and esteem that he never received from his stepmother, from his mother or his stepfather, and how critical it was for him to defend the South. At least the exaggerated and romanticized version of the South he imagined his natural father knew and represented. As Yancey took his stand on the stump, he joined a growing mass of Southerners who tried to explain and define the region. But more than any others, I'm arguing, Yancey consciously and explicitly described himself as the personification and the defender of the region. Momentous events occurring within the last few years and now threatening our national life have powerfully excited the attention of the differences in character which distinguish the people of the North and the South, he announced. Yancey sketched out the characteristics he considered prevalent for each section. He all but depicted the North as Reverend Beeman writ large. Cold, hard, determined, humorless, and businesslike at all times. New England, Yancey said, offered colonial settlers an antagonistic nature. Barren and unyielding in summer, cold and inhospitable in winter. The keener the mind, the more utilitarian, the more stern the denial of indulgence, the greater the chances of survival. Yancey asserted all culture and character came with this conflict with nature in New England. Unity of purpose among its inhabitants, the need for a pragmatic education, were all embodied by the Common School of New England. This species of education has given the North a unity of purpose and design in the material forms of civilization. But these qualities came with a cost. Northerners' materialism, Yancey explained to Alabama's youth, came at the expense of those sentiments which give breadth and scope to character and intellect, and which are absolutely necessary for a proper balance of character. In stark and happy contrast, Yancey's South was like the mother he never had, warm, loving, nurturing, and enabling. For the Cavaliers and Huguenots who settled the colonial South, Yancey asserted nature invited them, and listen to the language, to repose upon a bosom that, warmed by the southern sun, teemed with all the elements necessary to national growth. The southern soil, which is, with its never-tiring fertility, produced more than enough for all with but little effort. Unlike these unhappy Northerners, Southerners had no need for the association of labor and capital. Instead, individual independence of thought and movement followed his condition. Leisure, contemplation enlarged his faculties, the faculties of his mind, with no need for the Yankees' economy, with money not the great end of life's struggle. Free from care and giving full rein to genial influences, society became a pleasure, hospitality a general virtue. Despite Yancey's own relentless concern for making money and his personal disdain for leisure, Yancey seemed to genuinely believe these ideals characterized the South and rendered it superior to the North. No more telling and horrible manifestation of the difference between North and South to Yancey concerned how each had come to view their women. Although Yancey himself in 1845 had publicly advocated modernizing and expanding women's rights, a decade later, and with a new perspective on the sections and their peoples, politics, and values, Yancey now condemned the North for a meddling spirit which he believed attacked womanhood itself. That same spirit which would turn everything to gold, which condemns as useless everything that cannot contribute to the value of labor, has invaded the sphere of woman. Yancey argued that Northern men had desexed their women, brushed the down from her cheek, and raised the stiff beard in lieu. Materialism in the North condemned women as useless in their vocation as mothers and served instead to thrust them into the workplace. Horribly, Northern society had led women to believe that the rights of man are also women's rights, and the editorial chair, the medical, the legal, and clerical profession should be filled by her as well as by men. Women in the North had mounted the speaker's platform and joined in public harangues, and some even assimilated their wardrobe by wearing bloomers, ready for bestriding a fence or a saddle, as utility shall demand. In stark contrast, Yancey found Southern white women, like almost everything else in the South, happy and within a natural order of things. Southern white woman, he said, was loving, gentle, retiring, still a woman. She kept her home sacred, a sanctuary from man's noisy and rough world. For Yancey, the home provided opportunity and challenges, both sufficient and important enough to command her full attention and time. As the outside world turned ever more contentious and foreboding, so in proportion did Yancey's faith increase in old-fashioned Southern patriarchy. According to Yancey, patriarchal white Southerners improved upon nature's munificence by incorporating African slavery. Owing to the existence of slavery in the South, the laws of labor were fixed, permanent, under perfect control, he said. Slavery, in fact, worked so sympathetically within the region that to disturb that institution in any way would uproot the foundations of society. Therefore, conservatism became engrafted on white Southerners' minds, as well as habitual reverence for law and order, a fixed dislike of change. In contrast to the organic, harmonious South, to Yancey, Northern society had grown colder than its wintry and natural climate. In the North, the masses are day laborers, confined closely and unremittingly to the workshop, factory, or field. Few are their holidays, few are their hours of leisure. The Northern people obtained their information primarily from reading newspapers. Therefore, thoughts came to them cold, abstract, and remained unlikely to rouse them unless a particular fact affected them materially. Our own people, Yancey said, read less than the Northern people. Thousands of them cannot read. They labor less. They make less money, Yancey continued, but they have more leisure. They have more amusement. They are a far happier people. And white Southerners got their most important information not from an inorganic newspaper, sorry to the advertiser, but in public gatherings from a living person, an orator. By placing the public speaker at the center of his ordered society, Yancey finally and explicitly articulated how he had resolved his long personal struggle for acceptance and esteem. These popular lecturers diffuse among the people the great principles of government and government policy. True oratory, Yancey argued, was no mere exhibition of mere sentiments and declamation. Such oratory is not the mere rhetorician's art. It is not a fine show for a fine occasion, but a real, close-hearted contact with concerns of great and absorbing interest. The true orator spoke to reason and to affection, recognizing man has a heart as well as a head. He stirs the blood in the bosom of the age and arouses the energies and directs the hope and aims of manhood. The best model, he said, was Demosthenes, the great Greek orator from the time of Alexander. With these words, Yancey effectively proclaimed himself the Demosthenes of the South, or its new Patrick Henry, the man to rally his countrymen against a common foe, to defend all that was dear to him and them, and all that he cherished was nothing less than the slaveholding South. So this was the man who went on to call for the reopening of the African slave trade that Reverend Beeman so vehemently opposed. This was the man who supported William Walker's attempt to expand slavery into Nicaragua. This was the Yancey who transformed a commercial convention in Montgomery in 1858 into a secessionist rally, who split asunder the Democratic Party at its national convention in 1860 because it would not do as he bid, and who invited Northern delegates to join white Southerners, and I quote, amongst the master race, and put the Negro race to do the dirty work which God designed they should do. And this was the Yancey with a personal score to settle with Beeman through his brazen, outrageous campaign for secession in the North. This was the Yancey who introduced President-elect Jefferson Davis with the words, "The man and the hour have met." And this was the Yancey who championed the cause of the South in King Arthur's court and, in fact, all of Europe as the first major Confederate ambassador to Europe. And this was the same Yancey who faced his final, greatest conflict, to fight his own very nature, to become a diplomat and a statesman. And to the surprise of many, he transformed himself yet again and largely succeeded in his new roles in order to continue his lifelong struggle for security, order, and acceptance. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. If you would like to ask a question, raise your hand and we will give you the microphone, and please speak into the microphone. Pass this down, please.
Did I hear you correctly that Yancey rebuked Dixon Hall Lewis?
Yes, the question, did he rebuke Lewis? Because, again, the Alabama platform was designed to force the National Democratic Party to take it where Alabama Democrats withdraw. But in Lewis's mind, it was just trying to get some leverage for some short-term political gain within the party. And Yancey pledged his whole life and soul to walk out.
Well, then how did he handle himself with John Archer Elmore, who was the brother to
they're interrelated a lot.
And then the Rhett family married into the Elmore family.
Yes.
So how in the world did he handle himself didn't seem to be polite. He was always blunt. So how did he handle himself in that family situation?
You know, he and Elmore got along just fine. But remember, Dixon Hall Lewis was not as extreme as the Elmores and the Rhetts. And is one of the things very frustrating. I mean, as big as Thick of that book as came out, I just couldn't find very much correspondence between Yancey and Elmore, which in a way makes sense. They had the same law office down the street. They're probably not writing to each other and talking about things. So I wish I could give you a board. I saw a question in the back, and then we can come up to the front. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to thank you for writing this book. I had some respect for Yancey before you made this presentation. I think his outlook kind of faces and brings to point the same problems we have today.
I was talking to Sherry, this whole year.
He romanticized, we say. As a young man, I felt the same way about our part of the country. I think we have been propagandized so with the Yankee mentality that we have taken on some of this mess in ourselves.
I think people do this. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'm from Los Angeles. I was telling Sherry the final analysis for grad school for me was between UCLA and LSU. Yeah. And going to LSU and working with Bill Cooper, Jefferson Davis biographer, one of the best decisions I ever made in my life, because I love LA and I love it more since I've left it and realized, oh my gosh, that place has got a lot of problems. But it's still, in my heart home, but I just had this, I was blind.
Cool. I wish you'd write a book on the Corwin Amendment and then also the moral tariff and relate the South to that. How many people here are familiar with the Corwin Amendment? How about the moral tariff?
A little bit.
Well, the Corwin Amendment was an amendment that was passed on March the 2nd, 1861, after all the Southern original Confederacy had seceded. The Corwin Amendment was passed by both houses, stating that slavery would not be interfered with by the federal government in any place that it was holding forth at that time. The same day, March 2nd, 1861, the moral tariff was passed, which raised the tariff from 15% to 37%. At the time, the South was contributing about 75% of the money was going into the Treasury in Washington. About 75% of that was going up east. Take a look at it. I think you'd find it very interesting. When all we hear about is slavery is the cause of the war.
Yes, I was looking at a speech by Yancey, one he made in Memphis in 1860. And one thing that really struck me, it was published, and how many times they put an editorial comment about applause or much laughter. Or, I mean, he really. I'm just reading through that thing. You think this is a real stem winder. Yeah, and it came out in what you're saying, but it sounded like he could just mesmerize an audience.
That's a very good word. I mean, all the accounts that I have of his oratory, he apparently didn't move around very much. He was